Hey there, Chris from MTB training here. We just finished week 2 of the MTB mobility program and we're moving on to week 3. So in week 2 we looked deeper into the lower body mobility with an assessment, as well as had a particular session on the hip hinge and focused around the toe touch. So if you remember my video from last week for about week 1 was some of the participants who are struggling to hinge were also having troubles touching their toes. So simply just bending over, touching your toes. If they had difficulty doing that, they usually struggle with being able to get into a hip hinge position. So a couple different things I found with the people that had struggled hinging and also weren't able to touch their toes. So there's two things. One is simply flexibility, which is the most obvious thing, but is not always the case. So if you think you fall under the lack of hamstring flexibility, being able to touch your toes and holding back your hip hinge, simple test to do is the straight leg raise. So you simply lay down flat on your back, keeping your knee straight, lift your leg up. So you should get to 80 degrees if you're quote unquote normal. So if it's not 80 degrees, 90 degrees, or it's anything less, if it's less than that, like that, you have inflexible hamstrings. Or potentially, if you especially find you can't keep your lower back on the ground, there could be an abdominal strength issue with it. So if you can get 80 both ways, if you're able to get there, there's something else to look at. If you can't lift your leg up to at least 80, 90 degrees, basically perpendicular to the floor, stretch your hamstrings often, consistently, multiple times a day. The next thing to look at is how are you doing it? So one thing I saw with a few participants is they struggle to touch their toes, but you might say their hamstrings are still tight, but one thing they don't do is they're keeping their weight on their toes, so they're not getting this hips shifting back. So sometimes just saying, hey, shift your hips back doesn't actually fully correct the situation. So one thing I employed is something simple as a 2x4, a textbook, anything that's a couple inches wide or inches thick, is to put it on the ground and place your heels up on it and then toe touch. And what this does is it pushes your weight forward. So if you were to try to kind of keep your weight on your toes, you'll fall over. So what your body naturally does is start shifting your hips back. So you can do this with a toe touch. You can also do it with a hinge. If you're still having some challenges, a suggestion and one of the exercises in the program was get a foam roller, small ball or something like that, and either heels up on a board or flat, and eventually work down to flat feet. Is place a foam roller between your knees, squeeze the foam roller, add a little bit of tension to your abdominals, and then reach down and touch your toes. If this significantly, either of these techniques, raising your heels or squeezing a foam roller between your knees, improves your ability to touch your toes or get into a deeper hinge, it is something you want to focus on. It's going to improve your mobility in the hinge movement, because it is helping you basically do the pattern or do the movement correctly, as in shifting your hips back, keeping your center of gravity over top of your feet, and then the foam roller is actually helping engage your core. Finally, as I mentioned, stretching hamstrings. I'm going to give you a little bit of a tweak to how to stretch your hamstrings, which is common to get more out of your hamstring stretches. So a simple box, chair, anything that's not crazy high. So a lot of people place your foot up, bend forward, reach to touch your toes. What I'm going to suggest you do is really pay attention to your body position on this. Yeah, I talk about body position often when it comes to mountain biking. Is a lot of time you see where my hips are facing, they're open, facing away from my foot of the leg I'm stretching. Is try to get your foot that's on the ground, and your hips pointed towards that foot. And then try to stretch. You notice the stretch isn't very far. I'm not stretching very much, and I have adequately flexible hamstrings. So this really jacks up the stretch. It's because I'm stretching fibers of the hamstring that are not stretched in this position. If you really want to ramp it up, try to rotate your hip, your whole leg, so your foot points towards your midline, and then try to stretch. I can't even stretch in this position. It's so stiff, but it's amazing stretch on the outside of my hamstring, which frequently is the part of the hamstring that is less flexible, that will be limiting you in your flexibility. So if you're struggling with your hip hinge and your toe touch, give a couple of these a try. If you're seeing benefit, awesome. You're going to be hinging much better just from these few couple of techniques. Stay tuned for next week in the mobility program. We are diving into upper body mobility as well as the overhead squat mobility. While squatting isn't considered as sometimes shamed in mountain biking because you're supposed to hinge, not squat, but realize humans squat a lot in everyday life, and hinging and squatting are somewhat related in the movement pattern. And even when you're on your bike, there still is a component of a squat in a lot of the body positions you're in, as well as each pedal stroke is pretty much, or it's very similar to a single leg squat, which is why we're working on it in the MTB mobility program. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned.